Well, today we again have an interesting show. The Republicans and the Conservatives have now endorsed for a statewide office. And we are going to have on today Joseph Hernandez. So Joseph Hernandez is our candidate, the Republican Conservative endorsed candidate for the New York State Comptroller. The position of Comptroller is an extremely important position in New York State politics. The Comptroller is, as the name says, controls the money of the state, invests our money, and makes sure that we have what we need in terms of our finances. And so it's a very important job. Today, the current Comptroller has been in that office now for 3 terms, Tom DiNapoli. There are lots of issues in the Comptroller's office. In fact, he's being primaried by his own party. At least, I think 2 individuals are going to primary him. But we have an excellent candidate in Joseph Hernandez. This is a candidate who has a tremendous, tremendous backstory to be able to tell us. He's a candidate who was actually born in Cuba. His father was a political prisoner, and he, at the age of 7, his father was ill in jail. They put the family on a boat, sent them to Miami, and at the age of 7, he ended up in Miami. Now, the father washed dishes to support his family, and the mother cleaned houses. This is where they come from. And what Joe has said on numerous occasions is how much his parents loved this country and how much they appreciated coming to this country, to the fact that the father raised the American flag every day, lowered it every night, folded it, made sure the flag never touched the ground. That's how much he loved this country. And he instilled in his family the ethics of love for this country, the ethics of hard work, the ethics of education. So, Joe, are you with us?
I'm here, Ralph. How are you? Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm just giving our audience a little bit of your background, that you came here at the age of 7. And I want you to tell us that story because it means so much, I think, to our audience to know who the individual is that we're eventually going to vote for and what the background is and what motivates you. So give us a little bit, tell me about that situation, what your father had to endure in Cuba, how you ended up here into the United States, and what your father and mother taught you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And thank you for having me again. Listen, I am the American story. I came here, as you said, at the age of 7. My father was a political prisoner. My father stayed behind when most of my family left in '59 when the communists and Fidel moved into Cuba. My dad really felt that it was a short-lived political upheaval and that Castro wouldn't really control the country for a very long period of time. And of course, history shows us that that's not really what happened. So anyway, he was able to sort of survive during the regime, but right around 1978 or so, he, as is typical in these political environments and these communist societies, the local Communist Party leader did not like my father and, really wanted the remaining parts of our property. And so, they basically put him in prison for 7 years in a hard labor camp. And there, by just life chances, he got encephalitis. He got meningitis encephalitis, which is an inflammation of the brain. And he was in a coma for 6 months. And of course, when he came out of that coma, the communists were like, what are we going to do with this guy? He's partially paralyzed. Let's get him out of here. Lucky for us and my family, it was around 1980 or so, the Mariel boat lift was happening. And we were able to jump on board a fishing vessel across the Florida Straits during a storm. The whole family of 6 of us. And we came to this country with nothing. And the country welcomed us. We were legal immigrants. We went through the process of immigration and got our ability to call ourselves American, which is probably one of the proudest things my dad always called himself. And we came here, started from nothing. My dad washed dishes. My mom cleaned houses. And they told us to, love this country, work hard, and get educated. and that's what we did. We were raised with that mindset to really love America. And I'm running really to pay back America for what it did for us and our family.
You told us about your father raising the flag and folding it. Tell us about those kind of things.
Yeah, my dad. My dad, of course, was a proud Cuban, but he was a prouder American, I would argue. He really loved this country so much because he would tell us, look, this country gave you an opportunity and home and shelter when your own society didn't even do that for you. So he was a true patriot of patriots. And, he would fly the American flag every day. He would wake up in the morning before we went to school and run up the flag. And then at night he would bring it down, always making sure that it never touched the ground. He always instilled in us that the American flag was sacred. So, that's the way we were raised. And of course, as a kid, you're kind of wondering, why does my father do this? When the other fathers in the neighborhood didn't do this. And it's because he really appreciated the greatness of this country.
Because he knew where he came from. He knew what communism was. He knew what the difference was between our country and Cuba.
Yeah, no, he had a real dislike for socialist communism and this concept of collectivism because he really preached to us. He's like, look, these people teach you this utopia mindset that everybody is equal and accessible and we should, distribute wealth and whatever not. But in reality, he saw that the people in power were the ones that were really benefiting from that. Again, there's this one guy who put him in prison because he wanted his assets. And, it's a corrupt society. It's not communism and socialism is not a real situation, and it's being used. And it's kind of sad that it's being deployed here in the biggest city and the most important state in the country. And that's the reason I'm really running, to be quite honest.
So, again, your parents instilled education and hard work in the children, and certainly you became very well educated. So tell us a little bit about your educational background.
Yeah, no, I come, on my dad's side, there's, we have a lot of physicians in the family, and so I started my career as a scientist. That's really where I started my educational trajectory. I have a degree in neuroscience and a degree in molecular genetics from the University of Florida, and then also got a degree in finance from there as well. And we were able to sort of start that career down a pharmaceutical path. I also went to Yale and have a degree in biostatistics and epidemiology from Yale, and then I just wrapped up a degree at Oxford. So education was very important to us. It was very, very important. So we worked hard.
That's incredible that you've got all these degrees that you continued on. So, I mean, my family, again, I'm second generation born here in the United States. My father was the first generation. My grandparents immigrated here. But education was something that they knew their children could succeed in the United States. And certainly that was instilled in you.
Yeah, no, for sure. Look, my father, he said, look, I work so hard so that you guys have an opportunity and you can better yourself and your kids and our grandkids. And, that was that forward giving mindset of, sacrifice so you can have a better life in America. That is a consistent immigrant story. I mean, you go back to the Italians and the Irish and, anybody who's immigrated to this great country, this is kind of the theme, right? You sacrifice for your kids and you're able to do this in this society. I mean, that's the other thing that people forget. You can't do this in sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America. This doesn't happen, America is a place where you can come from nothing and in one generation, like we did, just transform your life, and do good. I mean,
unfortunately,
at the end of the day, you want to do good.
Unfortunately, that's not the immigration we're seeing today, the illegal immigration. They're coming here just to take advantage. But again,
Absolutely.
So you started your work in 1998 at Merck. And so how long did you stay at Merck?
I was at Merck for almost 5 years or so. I was part of the commercial team at Merck. I had a scientific background, so I had an advantage that I really understood the mechanism of actions of these pharmaceutical drugs, and I was, able to be part of a team that launched 3 major drugs in the pharmaceutical side of the equation. I learned, what it's like to run an ethical company. Merck is probably one of the most ethical companies I've ever been involved with, and it instilled in me sort of the value of, capitalism is great, and it's really what differentiates America. But you got to do that also within the norms of ethics, and have a moral compass in decision making. And I was happy and I was lucky to have that be my first entree into the business world.
Now you also have an MBA in finance and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, that's kind of where I learned my finance. And I've really, after I did Merck, I went to Silicon Valley. And in Silicon Valley, it used to be, I don't think it is anymore, to be quite honest, but it used to be the center of innovation for America. And, there I got the startup bug. I learned what it was like to build companies from nothing and from scratch, and to, introduce technologies, take risk, put capital at risk, but, have significant returns. And I really learned
finance
and how to really run and operate early stage companies.
So you had both both the scientific background for research, but also the business development. And then you went off and created a number of entities. Isn't that correct?
I did, yeah. And then so what's fascinating about Silicon Valley, and I think that's still the case today, is that it inspires you to sort of push the envelope and do new great things. And because of that experience, I was in Silicon Valley for almost 4 years. I really was inspired to start companies. So my first company I ever did was a spin out of MIT in the area of diagnostics. And so, we built a number of different companies from that experience, and, 12 of them, 5 of them, we were able to bring public. A number of them didn't succeed, but that's part of the equation in America. You have to try. But the track record is great, and we were quite successful. I was quite successful in really creating value out of these early technology companies. So I know how to finance. We also brought companies public, so I know the public markets. I understand, the importance of this role as it relates to the investment component of it. So yeah, I'm just lucky.
This background, that background is really something that's critically important in terms of a controller. So you have the background, you certainly have the educational background, you have the research background, but you have the business development background, which to me, again, is extremely important. You have the finance and entrepreneurship background. And then something else about you that intrigues me is your giving back, your willingness to give back, and the philanthropy. Tell us about what you did with the University of Florida, your alma mater.
Well, listen, I think giving back is part of the overall equation, and that's also not only in monetary but also in service. I am a true believer that you can change your life, and you can change your family's life in one generation. So I'm an immense believer in education and what education can bring. So I've been quite close to the universities I've attended, and University of Florida being one of them. But certainly I'm very close with Yale. I'm probably going to be joining the board of Yale pretty soon here, because I think you have to give back. And I was lucky. I was a lucky kid in a lot of ways. Hard work was part of it, but I think some people just need a financial kind of boost. So, I've been proud to create a number of scholarships to fund, first generation students, irrespective of their background. Just, if you're the first one in your family to go to college, I think, sometimes you need a little bit of help. And for me, a little bit of money that can change someone's life is, in my opinion, a great investment.
$10 million donation to the University of Florida?
Yeah, we did that. Obviously, COVID happened in the middle of it, so we kind of reshifted some of that money to scholarships because during that time, students didn't have access to money, and the world was stopped. So we redirected a big portion of that money to scholarships, which is something we continue today.
This is such a great backstory. I am so proud to know you and so proud to be able to be somewhat of a help to you because, again, and I want people to know that part of the story. We're going to spend the rest of the hour talking about the controller, what the controller does, what we need in New York, but I want people to know the kind of person you are. We're here speaking with Joseph Hernandez. You just heard a little bit about him. Coming from Cuba, and we spent the first segment of this show talking about that tremendous background and his love for this country, his parents' love for this country. If you want to call in and speak with Joe or ask a question, the studio line is 716-500-1270. 716-500-1270 if you have a question. So, first of all, Joe, let's talk about what the controller actually does. What really is the role of the New York State controller?
Well, the comptroller has, two main functions. One is the audit tool, which means, you are the watchdog for taxpayers' dollars. So your duty is to make sure the dollars that have been appropriated legally through the legislative process, that those dollars are in fact allocated correctly and done so in an efficient and fair way, that there's no fraud and abuse in the system. So the audit tool is a component of that is really, very important. That's the first thing. The other thing is the ability to, the role of managing the pension fund, which is a really important part of that. And those are really the two primary functions of the comptroller's office. And that with that carries a lot of responsibility. There's a lot of things that need to get done around that, and certainly managing the appropriate individuals to do those roles.
So the controller really is a checks and balances for state funding, for what's going on in the state, how we're spending money. The comptroller really is supposed to be looking at all those aspects, not from one side, from one political side. The comptroller is supposed to be looking at it from the point of view of those taxpayers and protecting the funds that we place into the hands of our state. Isn't that correct?
That's right. I mean, look, the reason this role is an independent role, and that was sort of the original concept of it's not only in New York, a number of different states have the role as a separately elected role, because that's what you're supposed to be. You're supposed to be a balanced adjudicator of the dollars. You're not supposed to allow politics into those decision-making processes, and it is intended to be the watchdog. You are ultimately the final say as to where a dollar goes. And the audit power of the comptroller is quite powerful. You basically have the ability, any check over $50,000 that's written in the state, the comptroller has to sign off on. So you have complete oversight, not only at the state level, but any other dollar that flows to the state and cities. So, for example, in New York City, the comptroller has the right and ability to audit the city finances. It has the right and the ability to audit private companies that receive dollars from the state. So the power is immense, and that's only one aspect of it, the audit. And look, we all know that in New York we have fraud and abuse. I think we're beginning to see, elements of that just coming to the surface. But when you have a budget this size, and specifically a Medicaid budget this size, which is about $117 million or $117 billion, you're going to have a massive fraud and abuse. And the comptroller's role is to get to the bottom of that, to adjudicate where these dollars should be and shouldn't be, and to create prosecution files so ultimately the people who are stealing from taxpayers pay the price. Because, look, we have to have deterrence. Deterrence is the only way to keep honesty in the system, and unfortunately that hasn't been done historically. And then the second part of the role is really an equally important role, and that is the management of the pension fund. So the pension fund in New York, is the second largest in America. It's a $300 billion fund, which is really money that belongs to people who gave their lives to the state, people who worked their whole life and their whole career for the state of New York. And we committed to them a retirement that was, commensurate with their commitment to the state. So we have the obligation to manage that fund, and the comptroller's role, needs to manage that and to generate returns so that they can pay off the commitments that the state has made, and to ensure that we're not taxed. The other thing about the pension fund is that if you don't raise enough capital, you have to pass the hat around the cities and the municipalities to contribute to the pension fund. And, that's an additional taxation. It's not fair to the taxpayers. So you have to make sure you get good returns on that fund. And that's the other part of this particular role, which is also important.
So I've looked at your three priorities. As you've just articulated. 1, protecting taxpayers, strengthening the pension fund. 2, holding government accountable, aggressive audits. And 3, investing in New York, using responsible pension investments. I want to talk about all three of those specifically. Let's start off with protecting taxpayers, strengthening the pension fund. Tell us what you plan to do.
Well, look, the pension fund, as I mentioned, is $300 billion. It's a massive fund. I mean, it's again one of the most powerful funds in America. So you have this particular fund has investments in companies like Microsoft and Google. Matter of fact, we have $3.6 billion in Microsoft and about $1.6 billion in Google. These are massive amounts of capital. You have large amounts of equity. You're a big shareholder, i.e. the pensioners are big shareholders to these big corporations. We are effectively putting money into the marketplace and expecting returns. The problem is that the fund has not been managed like but like a Wall Street investment-focused fund. And that's the way it should be. And for that reason, we have gotten really bad returns. Last year, the return to the fund was only 5.8% return, which is actually dismal because when you compare against Treasury bills are returning 4.25%. So you're effectively getting almost Treasury bill returns. You're paying Wall Street $1.4 billion in fees. You have 3,000 employees, and your budget is $600 million. You would be fired on Wall Street if you were running an operation like this. So, part of my endeavor around the first point is to really build an in-house investment team. So bring in professional investors in-house to effectively invest for the pensioners. This model has been used by CalPERS, has been used by the Ontario Teachers Union, by the Canadian Pension Fund, and they have seen double-digit returns because of this strategy. So I think we deserve that kind of return because every percentage point we get from the fund, it's effectively $3 billion that goes back to the state coffers so that we can honor our commitment to the pensioners and that we can effectively not ask people to pay taxes into the system. And I think that's a very important role. So we're going to change that strategy from an investment perspective. And, and again, that's only the first part of the strategy. The second part of the strategy is to make sure that we have real-time audits in the system.
Well, I want to go back a second, though. 3,000 employees in the comptroller's office, and yet we still pay $1.4 billion in outside fees?
That's right. It's incredible. And by the way, the exact number is more like close to 3,000. It's about, I think the last number was 2,780 employees or something like that. But the majority of those employees. By the way, the investment group in that number that I just referenced is insignificant. It's less than 100 people doing investments. We're paying Wall Street fees to the tune of $1.4 billion because we don't have the discipline or the ability to run that thing in house. So we have to pay all these fees to Wall Street. And of course, Wall Street, they do what they do, and they get paid no matter what. The other thing about the fund, which should make your blood boil a little bit, is we have used this fund for political purposes. We're doing things that are not in the best interest of the shareholders, i.e. the pensioners. Things like rolling out of the funds that are invested on Wall Street, 22% of them have a mandate to be invested in DEI-focused funds. These are funds that are run by, women and minorities. And that's not to say that there's not good operators there, but why mandate that? Why don't you just select the best investors to invest in the money? There's a lot of nuances in this fund that basically gets you to where you're at today, which is very, very low returns. You're a 5.8% return when CalPERS returned almost 12%. So we've got to do something there. My plan is to bring in an in-house investment team, focus on the areas of growth, things like venture capital, things like private credit, things like infrastructure, things like international investments. We don't do a lot of that. So, if you were to diversify the portfolio in a calculated way, and I'm not talking about taking risks, I'm talking about doing what the other funds do, your return should improve significantly. We should be in the double digits in no time, and that's what I plan to do.
Do we need both 2,800 employees and $1.4 billion worth of outside counseling? Do we need both of those?
We absolutely do not. I'm going to cut the Wall Street fees. And again, look, I have a lot of friends that work on Wall Street. I work on Wall Street. And they see the inefficiencies here. They don't understand how and why these. And by the way, the New York State Pension Fund is only one example. There's a lot of other funds. I would argue that the New York City Fund is very similar.
Yes.
They pay Wall Street funds an exorbitant amount of money. And I think, if you follow the money, these are big contributors to campaigns. So I'm not suggesting there's a quid pro quo here, but you got to follow the money sometimes.
Clearly, clearly that does happen. I mean, you can see just by following the money that clearly that's where they get a lot of their financial support, and they overpay.
Yeah. Look, I mean, $1.4 billion it sounds excessive. I mean, the other way was we structure these deals in a way that doesn't benefit downstream performance. So usually in a fund, you do what is called, you can do bolt-on deals. And what it means is, for example, if your fund that you invested in is an investor in one of these, Anthropic or one of these companies that's about to go public and really create significant amount of value. As a limited partner, which is what the fund is, you have the ability to bolt on deals. You have the ability to create contracts that allows you to invest on sidecar deals. They're called sidecar deals, where you're able to deploy the money and not have to pay these crazy fees. Our contracting with these funds does not have that in a majority of cases. So it's just also common sense. It's the way the business is done, and I think we don't have experienced operators managing this money. And I plan to change that. I plan to bring in the best people on Wall Street to manage this fund because our pensioners deserve that. Our taxpayers deserve that.
So when the fund doesn't produce enough money, what happens? We raise taxes.
So we have an obligation to the pensioners, right?
Yep.
And the numbers are coming out, but I think last year they paid the obligations to pensioners. These are people that are retired that worked in the system and that are enjoying their golden years, and as they should, right? And their grandkids or whatever not.
Right.
So we paid out, I think it's about $16 billion last year. So that means that if the fund doesn't generate $16 billion of returns, we effectively have to pass the hat to the taxpayer base in New York and say, whoops, we didn't make the payout, so you guys have to contribute. That's an obligation we have as a state. And of course, what happens is, smaller municipalities, smaller cities, they're left to decide, do I buy a new fire truck, or do I have to contribute to the pension? And of course, that has a significant impact on them. So it's not fair to them. So returns are important, not only for the pensioners, but also for the taxpayers.
And so your background, the businesses that you've created, the success that you've been able to bring a first generation, an immigrant really, the success you've been able to accomplish in your years, all of those things, that spirit, that knowledge, that entrepreneurship, that is all going to benefit us when you become, not if, but when you become the New York State Controller.
Yeah, I think we have to run this fund as a business. I always argue that government should be run like a business. At the end of the day, what is government? We're providing a service. We're getting paid to do that. We should provide the best quality service possible. I think that's lost. I mean, in political people, at the end of the day, you're providing a service that people are paying. They're obligated to pay to. You have to pay your taxes. But in reality, you should be creating a product that's beneficial to people that you serve. This particular role is no different. This should be run like a business. At the end of the day, this is about making money for the pensioners. That is the role. The role is to make sure you have the highest possible internal rate of return, doing so in an ethical way, but making sure that these people, again, that gave their lives to the state, have the resources to retire, and that we don't overburden our taxpayers. And it should be run like a business.
We're here with Joseph Hernandez, our candidate for New York State Comptroller. You just heard a little bit about him. We've talked now about the role of the comptroller in terms of investments. But there is another major aspect to the role of comptroller, and that's holding government accountable. This is where, you can criticize what's happened in terms of the return. As Joe has said, no manager in the private sector would still be a manager if he only brought the returns that we have brought under the New York State Controller we now have. But the more thing that sticks out so predominantly is the waste, the abuse, the fraud. So tell us a little bit about this holding government accountable. How have we gone wrong?
Look, the other important role of this office, as I mentioned earlier, is the power of the audit. In a public company, so if you're a CEO of a public company, you have to do quarterly audits, and so you do those 4 times a year. These are effectively, you have a third party, you have an accounting firm that comes in. They are supposed to do this arm's length. They go through the books. They see the dollars. They follow the flow of the dollars, who gets paid, who hasn't got paid, how much money you made, is that actual money, where does it go? We do this in the private sector quarterly. We do it 4 times a year. But in our government, for whatever reason, we didn't think that was a good idea. So we don't really have effective audit tools. And I would say that's broad. That's not only state government and local government. That's even at the federal level. We don't really audit the way we allocate our capital, and we should. It's obviously good governance in private sector. It's how investors trust the process, because they say, you know what, there is quote unquote a watchdog, and that's your auditors. Making sure that dollars are in fact there when they're there, and when they're not there, they're told that they're not there. So we don't do that in government, and then it just blows my mind that we don't use those tools. I think that we should. I think the power sits in the office. I think currently the current comptroller, does audit work here and there, but they're really toothless audits. They look back 6 years and we say, whoops, we messed up, or whoops, we lost that money, but nothing really happens. There's no change. There's no recommended changes. Nobody goes to prison. Nobody pays the price for effectively stealing, because when the dollars don't go where they're supposed to go, that's stealing, that's theft. And that only impacts the taxpayer base. That impacts the teachers that need that capital to educate their kids, the firemen that needs, the extra uniform to make sure they're safe and doing their jobs, and the roads that need to get paved. This is theft for everybody. It's broad theft. So I believe that we need to audit. We need to audit our government. I intend to audit New York State in the most aggressive fashion, probably in the history of the state. And what I'm going to do is the following. I'm going to bring in an in-house, what I'm calling the strike fraud team. And this is going to be a group within the comptroller's office. After I clean up shop in terms of the headcount we have there that are efficiently being allocated, we're going to bring in some people I mentioned on the investment side previously. But I think the other thing we really need strong oversight or management on is on this oversight role. And so I'm going to bring in a strike team that is going to be made up of the following people: forensic auditors. And these are people that can dive deep into the books and see where things are, where they shouldn't be. If we're losing money, if there's leakage in the system, if we're paying people extra, which, by the way, happens all the time. We pay vendors multiple times. And if you're not honest, you're going to keep the money. And unfortunately, a lot of these people don't give the money back. That, by the way, is a very common problem in the state of New York. We pay people multiple times. It's insanity. It's just insanity. You would never do this in a business. But anyway, so this fraud strike team that I want to put together encompasses forensic accountants that are going to dive deep in the book. We're going to hire career prosecutors and financial crimes. These are people that know what it takes to put a case together for financial crimes. We're going to button that up. We're going to create a file, because that's what you have to do for these prosecutions to really stick. We're going to create a file under the auspices of this office, and that file is going to be handed over to the Attorney General or federal prosecutors for prosecution. We're going to do that, and then we need to have a routine process to make sure this doesn't happen again. And the way to do that is to use technology. And technology exists to perform what I call real-time audits. And this is looking at the flows of capital from the state coffers to the cities, to the municipalities, to the vendors, to ensure that we're following the dollars in real time. And by the way, that technology exists today. It's being deployed in a number of companies, but also the federal government has deployed some of these, what I call artificial intelligence-based technologies that are very data-driven and very software-driven. These have been used in the Department of Treasury and a number of other places effectively. So we're not recreating the wheel here. We're just using technology that exists, making the process more efficient, making our ability to audit more transparent, and making sure that when people steal, they're held accountable. And we're going to do that. We're going to do that day one. We're going to build this team. It's going to be the most, I don't want to call it dodge because that's been already overused, but we're going to create a team in-house whose primary role is going to be to track the dollar, follow the money, and to make sure that the dollars are landing where they're supposed to. And when they're not, we're going to hold people accountable.
So, Joe, we have a caller. We have Rich from Buffalo. He has a question. Go ahead, Rich.
Yes, thanks, Ralph. Mr. Hernandez, I'm going to make a few points and then hang up and have you have you respond. There's so much information there. I don't know if I can absorb it all. And one setting. Perhaps my young nephew, who's a forensic CPA, would be able to. But I've had a little bit of a background in public finance, and I think it's crucially important our local governments, and I'm sure Mr. Lorigo would agree that they be watched. I recall one time I was sitting on a town board in the 90s, and I and another council member voted against the supervisor's proposed budget, which passed. But the comptroller's office saw the newspaper article. They came in, they audited. Oh, incidentally, that budget wanted a tax increase along with a salary increase for the supervisor and board members. And the auditors came in, and they found that there was some problems or money that was not accounted for properly, something sitting in a bank. There was and the supervisor went back with the bookkeeper, and he found several thousands of dollars, which allowed us to keep the tax rate at status quo. So it is so important that we keep an eye on these local governments. You see in the papers all the time there are these fire companies and other organizations where the treasurers are walking around out with the money. The other point I'd like to make is that from a practical standpoint, I would play up your Hispanic background, your Cuban background. I have many friendly neighbors who came from Cuba and are citizens, and they escaped the regime. And I think this is so important today, and, we have this ethnic politics in our state still, and downstate especially, and there's other Latinos and who also should get on board. Oh, one last point, Joe, is that I think the golden. Oh yes, real quick, when we had a controller, we had a county executive who ran 4 and 1 as controller. I don't know if you know his history, but Ned Reagan was very, very popular. And when he was campaigning, he said he wanted to use the power and the majesty of that's the word he used, the majesty of that office. It was really exciting. And so lastly, there's a golden opportunity for conservatives and Republicans, I feel, are in those two, quote-unquote, nonpartisan type should-be offices of comptroller and attorney general. I know everyone would like to have a governor, a state senate, and assembly, but we need to get a toehold in here. We need balance. We need a watchdog. We need some checks on the governor and the legislature. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you,
I
Rich.
wish you well, and I'm sure that Ralph will contact me about things I might be able to do to help. Okay?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think the local municipalities are an issue. I mean, I think you saw this most recently in New Haven, Connecticut. Where the local, unfortunately, police chief was kind of skimming money from a fund that was intended for informants. So this is a pervasive thing. And look, unfortunately, you have to trust, but you have to verify, and that's part of the trust process that exists in all financial networks. So we have to do that here. There's no different. And I think there's a lot of that, and we're going to clean it up. I mean, I think the technology's there to monitor this stuff and to keep a real eye on the dollars. And I think I agree with you. I think this is not a Republican or a Democratic issue or a conservative issue. This is an American issue. It's a broader issue, and it's trust in our government. We all want to trust our government. Some of us want less government than others, but we need to trust it. And I think this role is supposed to create that kind of judicial unbiasedness and trust in government. And the money is the center to all of it. So we got to create more trust.
So let's talk a little bit about Medicaid in New York State. Tell us what your opinion is about how we spend and or waste money in New York State in terms of Medicaid, the amount of fraud that actually takes place here.
Medicaid is a red big flag. I mean, it is. There are three areas in government that I consider immense red flags, and this is just my high level analysis of some of these numbers. Medicaid is screaming, fraud and abuse, and I'll tell you why. I mean, if you really look, and by the way, fraud and abuse often sticks out when you look at comparables, when you look at what other states do, how they're spending, in what direction. There should be some normalcy. Obviously, there's variations in the population that drive Medicaid costs one way or another. For example, in the state of Florida, there are older people, there are more retirees. So by definition, you should be spending more in Medicare, in Medicaid, perhaps as well. But that's not what you see. What you see is our budget in New York is $116 billion for Medicaid. For Medicaid, it is an astronomical amount of money. It is greater than on a per person basis, greater than the state of Florida, where you have a disproportionate amount of people who are elderly and are needing Medicaid. But so it's $116 billion. We've already seen aspects of fraud and abuse there. And again, we haven't even looked for it. These have just come our way accidentally in a lot of cases. For example, the CDPAP issue that happened in New York. And the CDPAP issue is one that outlined about $1.6 billion of fraud and abuse. And this is intended to be a program that is supposed to benefit people that are, incapacitated. And it basically pays their family members to take care of these people at home because it's a cheaper way than having them, the medical system take care of them. So it's intended it has good intentions, right? The problem is it's an easy program to abuse. And we saw evidence of that and prosecutions around that. And luckily, some people were convicted.